Hello and welcome to lesson number 25. And today's lesson or today's lecture will go through auditing steps, how you carry out an audit if you're an auditor, and how you write up a report and when you write up the report. The objectives of this lesson will be to cover things like the planning and preparation of an audit, as well as how to carry out the audit, different techniques that can be used as an auditor to obtain information, how and when you write up your audit report, and I'll also include some API assessment standards that you can look through as additional reading resource material. So audit planning. Firstly, the audit plan is a formal document which covers every area, every process and department for the audit activity that's going to be carried out. And it specifies the departments that are going to be audited, the frequency of the audit, and preferably the month in which the audit will happen. Or when the audit is scheduled to take place. The schedule then is the document that gives details of the area, process and department to be audited during the scheduled audit. It specifies things like the date of the audit, the name of the auditor, the corresponding auditee area and process. The timing is the best time to audit is when people are at their busiest and so tempted to take shortcuts or make mistakes, but convenience of the auditee is essential, and their readiness should be determined before proceeding with an audit. So they need to be given time to prepare before an auditor comes on site. So audit frequency is based on criticality of the area or the process that's being audited. It's based on the quality history of the area that's being audited also. General self-inspection program at defined frequency can be influenced by upcoming regulatory events. For example, if an FTA audit or a compliance audit is scheduled, then a self-inspection audit can be carried out in the area as a readiness check. Communicating the audit plan, so ensure that the schedule is communicated to all site personnel and clearly list the areas, the systems and the products that are going to be audited, listing specific dates for each of those audits. And realistically, where possible, establish and agree how long the audit will take. So selection of auditors for a particular area is normally based on educational qualification, industrial experience, in-house training or outside training, as well as technical knowledge of the individual. People within the organisation who have been trained to conduct audits are commonly used for self-inspections. The training can be done by the organisation itself if the expertise exists within the company, and there can be more than one auditor per department. Important precautions to be taken is to ensure that people don't audit their own area, because this will introduce a bias, and auditors must treat the audit as a fact-finding exercise, and obviously should do so in a professional manner. So as an auditor then, if you are inspecting a company or inspecting an area, you should prepare and send a detailed agenda, as well as the objectives and the scope of the audit to the auditee. You should have a good understanding of the regulatory requirements and standards that are in operation in the area or in the company or department that you're going to be auditing. Ensure that your auditee is well aware of the standards that you are going to be looking at during the audit. And sometimes it's easier to prepare a checklist, which are a methodical way of ensuring that all necessary areas are audited and the right questions are asked. So a checklist tool becomes important then. But an auditor should adapt a flexible approach and use their own judgment to deviate from the checklist if necessary, or if they discover an issue that they want to dig into further. So normally there's several steps involved in carrying out a quality audit, and as an auditor, the very first step would be to be present at the opening meeting. And this is, as an auditor, it's the first point of face-to-face contact with the auditee. So if you're an external auditor, this is an important one because you're meeting your auditees for the first time. So at this opening meeting, normally each side will introduce themselves, both the company as well as the auditors, and give a little bit of background on who people are. And as an auditor, it's important to understand the roles and responsibilities of the people that are attending that opening meeting, so that you can remember who they are, remember their name if possible, and what area that they're responsible for. As an auditor, it's important to reconfirm the agenda and discuss any modification or changes that were pre-agreed from both sides if necessary. The site normally make a departmental or a site presentation, and at that presentation the auditors would normally take down any important points or any information or areas that they want to inspect, and the auditor would normally give a brief presentation themselves, communicating the scope of the audit, and the objectives of the audit agenda, if you like. So I just covered the details within that slide. So the site tour then is a critical part of the very critical part of the audit. It gives the auditor a chance to walk around the site and get a feel for how the site is set up. It's important to use all senses when walking around the site, so you can see things or hear things or touch things that you may not necessarily have contact with if you're carrying out the audit in a conference room. It's important to respect the dress code of the area that you're visiting. So if there's a gowning procedure in place, then you as an auditor will need to gown up accordingly. Again, auditors will often ask to visit controlled areas or areas that are locked down for security reasons. An auditor will talk to workers during site visits or site tours, and if they ask questions, it's very important as an auditee that you understand what question is being asked and that you answer correctly. And if you don't understand, you can ask the auditor to repeat the question or look for clarification on that. So again, keep all senses open as an auditor when you're walking around the site. Stay close to the agreed plan of the tour and try not to get distracted or lose time. Be willing to stop and focus on an area of non-compliance, and keep a record of documents requested during the tour. And let the auditee know that you are keeping a record of all these requests, because they will need to actually pull all those documents for you and bring them to the conference room so you can look through them as the auditor. You can go back to any GMP areas towards the end of an audit and have a look and see, have things changed or are things being done differently since you first visited that area. Look and see, are supervisors actually supervising, and check the conditions of the building. Look for surface contamination, housekeeping, things like that, cleanliness of the area. Are gowning regimes appropriate? Are doors shut when not in use and pressure differentials monitored? Are all rooms, products and containers clearly labelled? Are SOPs available for operators? Is appropriate pest control in place? And are logbooks maintained and easily accessible within the areas that are visited on the site tour? So the conference room audit then, normally there's quite a lot of people in the room during the audit, but the number really should be limited to those people that are only necessary. So if you're auditing, for example, the production area, then there's no need for, say, a salesperson to be in the room. So keep the number of people within that area, within the room, limited. And you can open a conference room audit in one of the following ways as an auditor. You can open by literally the first item on your agenda. You can talk through that. The list of documents that you requested during the tour, you can go through those and give the auditee time to pull those documents for you. List any GMP violations that were seen during the site tour. By asking questions relating to the documents you're analysing before the audit began. So before an audit begins and before you actually reach the site, sometimes an auditor will look for documents to be sent to them prior to the commencement of the audit. You can request production and process review records, supporting procedures, personal training, or you can just start at the beginning of the process flow and work your way through that, requesting relevant documents throughout each step of the process. So there's different auditing techniques that an auditor can use. They can use the horizontal technique, which is just skimming the surface of documents, where you follow a process from, say, goods receipt of raw materials right through to finished product release and distribution of the final product. And it's a good way to get a feel for how the process is working or how the site works, along with any problems that may be encountered. Another technique is the vertical technique, which is really an in-depth way of looking through the systems. It's good to help identify severity of any specific issues that may be highlighted. It can be quite time consuming. So I suppose as an auditor, you need to know when to stop and move on to the next issue. It gives a greater and in-depth focus into a specific area or into a specific problem. But I suppose the ideal combination would be to use both the horizontal and the vertical technique. Ideally, a CGMP audit should include horizontal auditing primarily, as well as some occasional vertical auditing where possible issues are noted or something doesn't feel right. You can horizontally skim through the surface of those procedures. Again, continuing with different auditing techniques, the beginning to end technique is one where you start at the beginning of a process and you follow through the work or follow through the process steps right to the very end. It gives it provides the auditor with a progressive, detailed view of the process and the requirements. Batch records are a good way of stepping through this process, and it's probably the most common approach to process auditing. The end to beginning technique is another one. It's good for assessing complaints, batch failures, reworks, etc. Begin with a known problem. So pick a deviation or pick a recall or a rework and trace it back to its origin. It's generally a focused approach which leads to investigation of your root cause analysis. Random sampling, it's good when time is limited and it gives you a good feel for how the site operates. It's quite flexible in nature. Regardless of what technique is used, the auditor will always look at the related documentation associated with the area. And an auditor will record all of the details as accurately as possible during the inspection, including what the problem was, where it occurred, when, who, why. Those kind of questions are a good pointer. So continuing with the thread of questioning techniques, different auditors have different ways of asking questions to employees or to the auditee. One of those approaches would be called the open question. So open questions require a factual, detailed response by the auditee. The answers to open-ended questions will tell you if the auditee understands the question. It creates a dialogue between the auditor and the auditee. The auditee begins to understand what it is you will be asking for and becomes better prepared to provide it. So it's a great way of saving time. Generally, open-ended questions will lead to another dialogue. So typical examples would be, how do you perform this process? Or can you describe the site's GMP training program? Or an auditor might ask an operator, what is your program for the HEPA filter certification? So that opens up a dialogue and creates a better engagement between auditor and auditee. Closed questions then require a simple yes or a no from the auditee. And in these cases, the auditor or the answer doesn't allow the auditor to judge if the question has been fully understood or not. It doesn't promote dialogue between the auditor and the auditee, and it requires that the auditor follow up with a second or a third question. So really the auditor in this point is doing a lot of the work and it's quite time consuming. Some of these kind of yes-no questions would be, are products manufactured using batch records? Are the operators responsible for entering process data into the batch record? Are the operators responsible for recognizing and recording deviations? So they're the kind of yes-no answers that are covered under the closed question technique. So the optimum approach would be to ask a combination of both open and closed questions. So some examples that I have here, do you have a system for recording and addressing deviations? Answer would be yes, we do. Oh, excellent. Would you please describe how this system works? So that's an open question. Who is responsible for registering deviations that occur during the manufacturing process? So the answer here would be the operators are responsible for recording any deviations. Is that both production and packaging operators? Yes, it is. Please tell me how you train your manufacturing operators to recognize a deviation. So that's a combination of both. It opens up good dialogue and it'll highlight if there's any errors or any systems that need further probing in the area by the auditor. So clarification of questions, or if questions aren't understood correctly, the auditor should repeat the question again. You just basically say, I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Can you repeat it? And the auditor should either repeat it or rephrase the question for clarity, or the auditor could draw a simple diagram or use an example to clarify what it is they're looking for. Sometimes an auditor can follow up a question with show me evidence of request. So an auditor could request documentation for a critical point that was discussed. They can also periodically request documentation throughout the audit for small points that were picked up during the audit. So once the audit is completed, or even at the end of the first day of the audit, you need to do a daily wrap-up. And the daily wrap-up includes the auditor as well as all of the auditees that were required on that day, or any of the people that escorted the auditor around the site. Normally the auditor won't categorise any of the issues that were discovered on that day, whether they be critical, major or minor, because tomorrow he or she may make further observations that could elevate a minor observation to a major observation. So it's not categorised until the final report is issued. The auditor normally discusses the observations that were found during that day, and that gives the site a chance to correct them or to provide more evidence to support their defence. Daily meetings promote understanding and prevent surprises at the final wrap-up or the final report closeout meeting. It allows the auditee to clarify and follow up on items for the next day's agenda. And the daily wrap-up provides clarity and keeps the auditee engaged in the process. So classification of some audit observations would be either critical, major, or minor. Critical, we would have discussed previously, critical would have a patient risk. Some of the things would be no key system in place, for example, no deviation system in place, or a critical observation would be a condition which would make the product unfit for use. Or a previous audit finding that hasn't been addressed adequately by the company. A critical issue could require further operations to stop until corrective actions have been implemented at the time. Major then would be significant problems in the plant or systems which lead to non-life-threatening conditions or systems not functioning properly with several similar observations noted. These problems will most likely result in a citation by regulatory authorities. Previous minor audits can be considered as major if they've not been suitably addressed by the site. And minor issues then would be isolated in nature. They do not cause harm to the patient or the product, but they would indicate a breach in CGMP regulations. And if a significant number of minor observations are made in an area, it could be indicative of the start of a breakdown of a system, and therefore an auditor could classify several minors as one major in their closeout or in their final report. So as an auditor then, in your closeout meeting or when the audit is complete, at that final meeting, obviously you thank all the auditees for their help and time, because a lot of time is taken out of routine manufacture and routine schedule to work on the audit. So it's necessary to thank your auditees for the support. An auditor will normally list all the good things that were observed or found during an audit. They'll present the criticality of observations that were found during the audit, normally with the highest first or the critical first. They'll focus on critical and major observations. They will add minor observations if there weren't too many findings in total. Findings are presented on a fact basis and backed up with information that were contained in regulatory standards, or backed up with some observations that were discovered with, say, inappropriate SOPs or inappropriate standards. An auditor must respond to questions openly at the end of an audit, and sometimes they need to change their wording in their final report, or even change the status of some of the observations if the auditee presents additional facts at that final closeout meeting. So the auditor then will go away and prep their final report after that closeout meeting. So why does an auditor write up a report? Well, it's an obvious, it's a record of the site or departmental deficiencies, and it provides site management with an independent report of the deficiencies that were identified during the audit. It creates a formal environment necessary for an active or periodic follow-up. How do auditors write reports? So normally they include all the positive points as well as all the deficiencies that were identified during the audit. Management must have a balanced overview of conditions within the plant, so therefore it's important to provide them with the areas of strengths or best practices, as well as the areas that require improvement. An auditor will normally write up their report as soon as possible after the conclusion of the audit, and obviously before they begin their next audit on their next site or their next company. It's very important for an auditor to complete their audit report as soon as they can, before they forget any of the observations, or before they move on to their next auditing site. And as an auditor, you need to commit to the time of delivery of your audit report, and obviously stick to that timing as best as you can. Compile the observations and add them to the end of the report. You send the audit report and the observations along with a cover letter or an email to the auditee or to the site management team. Ensure that you include firm instructions for reporting corrective and preventative actions back to you as the auditor. Provide the easiest and most convenient reporting formats such as Word or Excel. And as an auditor, if you're auditing several sites, it's important that you have a self-notification process that can tell you when someone or when a site is overdue for reporting the corrective actions. Follow up with late responses from sites, and elevate non-responses or observations to the management level. And Again, as an auditor, remember that the performing the audit is the easiest part of the process. Audit observations follow-up is the most difficult and time-consuming facet of the audit. Ensure that as an auditor, you follow up each observation through to its final CGMP conclusion, and obviously never give up, because you need to follow up with your site to make sure that they are closing out those observations and those corrective and preventative actions. So some of the API assessment standards are included in this this slide. They will be in the supplementary material. Please read through them. It's important to read through them, and it'll build on your knowledge of auditing, audit reports and requirements around the same. That's it. Thank you for listening.